peace in the area seems to be due principally to the large police response and the increased numbers of officers in the area. At the same time, the numbers of whites who are boycotting has remained at the high level. What is it going to take to get people in South Boston to agree to go to school out of their neighborhood, and how is that going to come about?
Obviously, time and patience by us, a willingness to stick it out, a willingness to know that none of us like the situation, not the least being the police. But the fact is that we're faced with a law, and it is going to be implemented, and we're charged with implementing it, and no matter how long it takes, that's precisely what will have to be done in this city, and we'll do it.
For almost 2 years, the constitutional rights, which are the highest values of our nation, have been denied by some to others.
6 deep and turned the Charlestown situation from the proverbial uneasy calm to very tense and ugly. Both reporters and police were seen as enemies of Charlestown today, the target of jeers, epithets, and sometimes bottles and rocks.
During the early 1970s, a time of severe racial tension and segregation in Boston, many students desired for the right to be educated. In order to achieve this goal, U.S. District Judge W. Arthur Garrity made a ruling on the Morgan v. Hennigan case in an attempt to restore the right to equal education for Boston children. The plan was to bus students from a school with a high number of white students to a school with a low number of white students, and vice versa, bus students from a school with a high number of black students to a school with a low number of black students. Rather than improving the situation, his decision had disastrous short-term results as well as a counterproductive long-term impact.
A changed Boston regains control of its school system.
But the civil unrest among races spans far prior to 1974 when busing was implemented. Years before the desegregation of schools in Boston, the United States was plagued by racial segregation. Stores, drinking fountains, and schools were all racially divided. The catalyst for the nationwide desegregation of schools was the landmark court case Brown v. Board of Education. In 1951, a lawsuit was filed against the Board of Education of the city of Topeka, Kansas. The plaintiffs were 13 Topeka parents on behalf of their children. The parents stated that as a result of racial separation, black students were getting inferior accommodations such as services and supplies to those of white students. The Supreme Court ruled that separate public schools for black and white students was unconstitutional, as United States citizens are guaranteed the right to an equal education. A similar court case, Morgan v. Hennigan, did for the city of Boston what Brown v. Board of Education started for the nation. Since the Second World War, the black population in Boston had grown rapidly, and housing and schools had seen increased segregation. In 1960, nearly 80% of black public elementary school students attended majority black schools. Over 35% of all black elementary school students attended schools that were 90 to 100% black. In 1961, the city of Boston adopted an open enrollment policy allowing black students to transfer to predominantly white schools. 4 years later, in 1965, the Advisory Committee to the Massachusetts State Commissioner of Education found that open enrollment cannot alone achieve school integration, and that relying on open enrollment places the responsibility for school integration on the uncoordinated actions of thousands of parents.
You have kids going to school? Yes, I have 2.
Rather than on the planned actions of the schools themselves. These findings, along with growing pressure from the state's black community, prompted the state to adopt the Racial Imbalance Act of 1965.
In 1965, the Massachusetts State's legislature proclaimed that no racially balanced school could be more than 50% black.
Although it seemed like a stepping stone towards desegregation, the Act's vague guidelines for compliance allowed the Boston School Committee to delay and ultimately neglect integration. Over the course of the next 8 years, education authorities in Massachusetts tried in vain to implement the Racial Imbalance Act and prompt the Boston School Committee to desegregate a decent sum of its public schools. Black parents, having lost faith in the Boston School Committee, took the initiative and started programs such as Operation Exodus and the Metropolitan Council for Educational Opportunity, otherwise known as METCO, to further their goal of equal education for their children. On March 5, 1972, the City of Boston School Committee was sued by the Harvard Center for Law and Education, alleging de jure segregation among students at Boston Public Schools. The case, titled Morgan v. Hennigan, is derived from the names of the lead plaintiff, Tallulah Morgan, and the defendant, James Hennigan, who was president of the Boston School Committee at the time. On June 21, 1974, after 2 years of deliberation, Judge W. Arthur Garrity ruled in favor of the plaintiffs that the school committee had maintained de facto segregation. This sparked a crisis that would affect the lives of every family in Boston. Garrity took it upon himself to desegregate the Boston public schools, introducing a system of involuntary inter-district transportation, where students would be bused across the city in an effort to racially balance schools. For the first measure, Garrity decided that the Supreme Court was to implement the State Board of Education's Racial Imbalance Plan, which was initially rejected for containing too much busing. This period was referred to as Phase 1 and was to go into action on the first day of the upcoming school year, September 12, 1974, just 2 months after the Morgan v. Hennigan court decision. Many Boston residents initially opposed this plan, claiming it violated their right to education and lashed out over the sheer inconvenience it posed to them.
And school starts Thursday, and their backs are up against the wall.
A new touch was the abundance of tea bags, apparently to signify that the demonstrators were in the same vein as those who tipped the tea into the harbor.
As elected officials of the Boston School Committee, that we don't have the right to stand up for the people we represent. And I say to the mayor that what he said is bogus.
I say it's tension in the school. There's a lot of tension, but it takes just a little bit to start it off.
On only the second day of school, Mayor Kevin White had the Boston police called in, and a court order allowed him to draw on state police and National Guard, ensuring there would be ample security provided in the event that any violence erupted. A unit of the Boston Police Department, the Tactical Patrol Forces, or TPF, were called in to settle things when violence broke out.
And why is it that you don't think people like you as much?
Well, I think it's the job that we've got to do. We've got to do more than the districts do. We've got to go in there, and when it gets so bad that they call us in, we've got a certain job, trouble must be put down.
Schools were torn apart, and the learning environment was severely disrupted.
The attendance today was 321 blacks, 50 whites, and 11 of other minorities out of an estimated enrollment of 4,000.
Student attendance was low, and parents were outraged as the plan that was intended to preserve the basic right to education did nothing but damage the education that the Boston School Committee was responsible for providing.
The black parents who supported the court order thought they were doing the right thing. We thought we were doing the right thing.
Violence wasn't confined by the school walls and extended throughout the city of Boston, including the very streets on which the buses drove.
A strange crowd just surrounded Kennedy. As he walked towards the Federal Building, tomatoes and newspapers started flying, and the nonviolence stopped.
The immediate social effects of Judge Garrity's decision were clear from the start.
Exercise our rights as citizens, the few we have left.
But the true lasting impact it had wasn't apparent until years later. The social experiment that Garrity created in busing caused violence, a falling out amongst people of the same region, and even more segregation than before. The various personal rights that people had were violated, and the shifting blame and opinion in who was responsible for it all are far-spanning and still felt amongst people today.
Ramifications, but I still am not comfortable that it's been dealt with.
What of the integration of class?
That hasn't been done either. How do you integrate a system that's predominantly black and Hispanic and poor and have the majority in the schools? And most of your white middle class and black middle class have left.